Hello, this is DevLog 3 for Ludo City project that I'm working on. This devlog mostly focuses on various tangents and bugs that I have run into, mostly of my own doing. So let's quickly look at where I am today, which visually is no further ahead than last week. I'll kind of highlight what changes I've made in the last week. Right. Changes from the previous, let's kind of get right into it. The first thing I did was last week I showed mouse locking functionality. Turns out how I've written that mouse locking functionality was, I don't want to say broken, but not ideal. So this time around, what I've done is, if I'm capturing the mouse, right, and that's just a simple flag, if I set this to true, it'll capture the mouse, and the window is active, then it will lock the mouse. We go in here by using Windows's clip cursor function. Right? So this will clip it to the window itself. The issue with the previous mechanism where I was using raw input to capture the mouse is that with using raw input flags to capture the mouse, it doesn't send legacy messages, so you can't use the mouse to close the window. And you can't lock the mouse to the window, so the mouse still flies around everywhere and can still click outside the window, just not within the window. So the behavior wasn't ideal. So to kind of demonstrate this, if we go here and I change this to true and I run this, now the mouse is locked to the frame, as you can see, but it still works, right? And I can still click on these elements up here, close it, and that's good. Right. Get rid of that. The other changes I made were I changed how I'm setting up the pipelines. Right. Now I add a pipeline, so I can have multiple pipelines here. You can see some commented out code where I'm adding a different pipeline with a different shader. So I can have multiple pipelines, which can then be utilized in the render packet by, I can now send in multiple packets. So here's a vector of packets. And the idea is that I would have it set up such that you have pipelines. Each pipeline can have multiple meshes. And then the meshes can then have their own independent data. So these two would eventually be merged into an object that you can have multiple of. All right. I haven't gotten there yet, but that's the plan. The other thing I got, so a lot of those changes also resulted in me changing how my render class works. So previously, this class was pretty large. I had a whole bunch of lambdas in here that did different functions. I've now split those lambdas out into their own methods here and here, as well as move some of the methods into a different buffer, or different object, I should say. So now I have a mesh buffer object, which takes the vertices and indices. I no longer have to do a translation or conversion of it into a span here. I can just pass it as a mesh description. It will create the vertex buffer and the index buffer for it. copy the data, right? And I added a bind and draw method, which kind of made sense to have it with the mesh buffer. This may change again in the future, but for the time being, this is the model. And it kind of still works the same way for go through all the meshes, where the mesh matches our render packet pipeline. We kind of just bind the pipeline and then update the push constants and bind the buffers. And then we do that for every packet that we get, right? And because packets are already organized by the pipelines, there should be no duplication, I hope. I briefly tested this. It does work. I then ran into other problems. So my other problems were with my window class. I was finding that WM size wasn't working correctly, in that I would change the size of the window and it would not resize. So for example, if I ran it and I did that, it would not resize the frame buffer because the thing is, these messages did not get sent to the resize WM size message. So I've changed that now to use the window pause changed event, where I get the sizes and then I call the callbacks appropriately. And this works a lot better than the WM size message, because this works for all instances. And the other thing I had to do was make sure to clear out my callbacks before destroying the window, because if I don't do that, it would call this resize, because on Windows destruction it also still has a resize event because the window doesn't exist, and the render by this point has already been deleted or destroyed. So calling a resize on a destroyed object results in bad behaviors, right? Given the order in which these are constructed, by the time the destructor runs for a window, render is already gone, right? So that was that issue that I resolved. The behavior is much nicer now, it's much cleaner. So if you look at look, I got typos, but the order is correct. And then the last thing I added also in the renderer this week was an output in the destructor of device. Let's go to device, go to destructor. I now write out memory stats. Memory stats for the VMA, which outputs in the bin upon closing a little statistic of what memory got used, how much of it got used. So that's kind of helpful for debugging purposes. Okay. That's great. What else did I do and change? A lot of the work this week ended up being around the renderer and the application, because I sidetracked trying to get a grid rendered on in the window. However, to get the grid rendered, the idea was that I would also set up the uniform buffers, and then I kind of got confused by how whole descriptor set stuff is supposed to work. Had several false starts. So that's where I am. So lots of refactoring, lots of bug hunting, lots of false starts. Now, hopefully next week, I will have uniform buffer working with descriptor sets. So it's not just uniform buffers, it's uniform buffers with descriptor sets and descriptor pools. Render an infinite grid using just the shaders, and then get on to texturing. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks.